Lovely to have you all on. My name is Grace Murray-Vazquez. Shout out to my new hyphenated name, just got married. VP of Strategy here at Fohr. I've been here for coming up on 10 years, which is kind of wild, and have run a few influencer trips in my day. We do less of them now at Fohr, but they are still a part of the mix here and there. But we're super excited again to talk today about where and when we think they make sense and how to avoid a bad one. And I'm joined by a wonderful guest.
Hello. Hey, y'all. I'm Sophie. I'm a senior creative strategist here at Fohr. I'm coming up on 3 years at the company. I work on the overall strategy and creative for our ambassador programs and ad hoc campaigns. And then I also just research like industry trends and shifts within the space so that our strategies are always reflective of that. And I feel like influencer trips is a hot topic. So excited to chat today. And then outside of work, I'm also a creator myself. So kind of fun to be on both sides of the spectrum.
Follow along, a great follow. Handles there for you, right for the picking. Okay, amazing. So to get us started, for anyone who's not familiar, I know we have a bunch of our amazing clients joining, maybe some people we haven't spoken to before. I think we've also got a couple of our competitors in the mix, so hello to you. But we are a tech-powered influencer marketing company out of New York. We are very proud to work with some of the best brands in the world, in the space, across a huge variety of verticals: fashion, beauty, lifestyle, travel. And, you know, amidst all of those verticals, there are a decent amount of those brands who have done trips or maybe plan to in the future. So today we're going to go over a brief history of influencer trips. We are then going to go into where they can go wrong, how to get it right, of course, and some key takeaways. On this very slide, we actually have one of our very early trips for Armani fragrances in about 2016, I think. So again, fun to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane here today. And if you have any questions throughout, there's a Q&A box. Feel free to drop them in. Hopefully we'll have some time to get to all of them, but often we don't, and we'd love to hear from you. So drop them in the Q&A or reach out to us at hello@fohr.co. We always love connecting with as many brands as we can, and happy to answer all of your questions. So to kick this walk down memory lane off, and I'm feeling a little bit like the kind of grandmother of influencer marketing here, but we're going to cover off on a brief history of influencer trips, starting with the 2000s. So a little bit of a rewind for us, back to the era where it felt like this is kind of the, I guess, heyday of the PR girl. Obviously, PR has existed for a long time predating this, but influencer trips really born out of editor trips, press trips. They walked so influencer trips could run. Brands hosting editors on these kind of free, experiential, time-intensive moments to educate them on their products, to be able to build connections and build relationships and really build out that Rolodex. This is where things really kind of kicked off, and the end goal of those types of activations was to get those brands featured in publications. And again, 2000s, think of like Devil Wears Prada era. This is Lauren Conrad working for Kelly Cutrone. This is like the ultimate glamorization of magazine editors period of time. We then have the dawn of influencer trips. So, you know, we saw in a recent glossy article about this phenomenon of influencer trips and their place in the marketing mix. One of the biggest players, Revolve, and their chief brand officer has mentioned that they first started their trips in 2014. They started with 2 influencers and were probably the first to do it. Proud to say at Fohr, this was also when our first trip was. It was a pretty low-key one, upstate for Anne Klein, but this was when we first activated in a trip capacity. And, you know, this was really when things kicked off and were very much approached in a similar way to how you know, same mindset as editor trips. We then enter a period where trips are being run more frequently by a lot of early adopters of influencer marketing. So think luxury fragrance houses, luxury beauty. But it's very much, again, still in that mindset of approaching it like a press trip. Influencers aren't even really necessarily considered a real form of marketing yet. This is still in the time period where a lot of people were just referring to bloggers and not influencers. So the idea of inviting someone along and treating them to a lavish experience and hoping and kind of expecting that they're going to post in exchange for that was really typical of the time. That's why we call this flower wall era. I'm sure a lot of marketers on the line will remember a period where it felt like every event that you went to, there was an enormous floral installation. And honestly, that's kind of all you needed to be able to ensure that influencers were going to be posting at your events. Because again, it was very early days. There wasn't a lot of money being spent in the space yet. And a lot of the money was being invested into these experiences or photo opportunities that felt very instant-worthy instead of pay-to-play contracts. And it was the same for influencers. It was early on, not many players in the space, not as much money in the space. And so they were accepting a lot of these opportunities. There was, a lot of the time, very little or no deliverables outlined, let alone content review. So a very different period of time. But then we entered a period where a little more structure came into play for both sides. Influencers on the first trip you're invited to, it might seem really exciting to be put up in a hotel and have this amazing experience. But many find out soon after that it's great as a kind of novel experience. It's not something that can be sustainable. And a lot of brands were activating this type of strategy because brands, again, were seeing that investing money in this type of experience was often yielding better results than when they were just paying to play, or more kind of hitting high numbers for the same budget. So for influencers, they want a little more. They're waking up to this idea that their time was valuable, that trips don't pay the bills. And for brands as well, there was a decent amount of, wanting to have that assurance that their money is going to be well placed. These trips were getting more involved, more expensive. And there was probably also a few instances of feeling a little burned, of taking people onto these amazing trips, not seeing that return. So contracts and structure were introduced. But at this time, trips really were still more about on-site experience and really tailored to and built upon the idea of deep relationship building, knowing that strong relationships with editors or with influencers always yield really strong business results. So all of the planning was through that lens of, is this going to be an amazing time? How do we kind of roll out the red carpet? Are we setting up an experience that is going to yield amazing content, but also set us up to be able to connect and engage and learn about each other and have these influencers learn about our products and our brand. And I think a key thing to note here is that this was very much still images era, no short form video and no Instagram stories just yet. They launched late this year and then really changed the nature of influencer trips. Because when you all of a sudden don't just have a handful of deliverables to, a handful of still images that you have to shoot on a couple of day trip, and you can kick back the rest of the time, and so can your brand contacts, and you can all get to know each other and really develop those relationships. Now all of a sudden it's, the influencers could be shooting a quick little snap at any moment. We want to brand everything. We want to make sure that every single napkin, vase, whatever it is branded as an opportunity for bonus content. There was also, trips have really grown to their kind of peak here. Again, a lot more money being invested year over year. They're getting more and more lavish as time goes on. It's private jets, it's dinner in castles, it's Dior in Dubai. And importantly, consumers really didn't mind. They didn't have any kind of reflex or ick or, any kind of response to just pure aspiration. And that is, at that time we were running regular trips for private jet companies as an example. And we really weren't doing any assessment at that time of potential negative consumer sentiment or potential backlash in any way, because it really wasn't a factor at that time. But then, of course, the world fundamentally changed. We hit 2020. There's, of course, the logistical piece of this, where it was physically impossible to run influencer trips. So everything came to a screeching halt. but it was also a huge shift in the consumer mindset, away from pure aspiration, away from comfort with that, and away from swing into more relatable content. Big call from consumers to brands and influencers for transparency. And again, just the landscape really shifted in this time in a way that we're still at a macro cultural level still experiencing. And ultimately that logistical impossibility extended into 2021, and the kind of caution, I think, extended into 2022. But now we're here in 2023, and trips are back, and it feels in some ways almost as if they never left. And there's some trips that are now being run where, the discussions we've been having is that the consumer mindset has changed so much, but it's feeling as though a lot of brand strategies haven't. And with some recent faux pas and misses in the space, it's seeming that it's starting to just feel as though it's more common to get trips wrong than it is to get them right.
So I think the most recent and prominent trip that probably comes to mind in the not getting it right space is Tarte's influencer trip to Miami for the Formula One race. So if you're not familiar, a very brief TLDR is that an influencer, Bria Jones, basically posted a TikTok video explaining that she was invited by Tarte to go on this trip to Miami for the Formula One race. But last minute, she opted out after realizing that she was actually being treated unfairly in comparison to non-Black influencers who were going on the trip. So basically, Tarte had given Bria the itinerary that she would come, she would get to watch these practice races, but then she was getting sent home early in comparison to white creators who were staying longer and getting to see the main race event. And so Bria basically made a video saying, once I realized this, like, I don't want to be on a trip where I feel like I'm being treated unfairly, like a second-class citizen. So I decided to opt out. So Bria's video sparked a huge amount of discourse, primarily on TikTok. And Tarte's CEO made a get ready with me style response video, which was pretty widely considered as inappropriate, insensitive, lacking accountability. She then made, a second one trying to rectify that, which didn't really do much. But all this to say that this really wasn't just like a blip. The term Tarte controversy has nearly 1 billion views on TikTok, which is wild. And that's, primarily creators talking amongst one another. Similarly, the hashtag Tarte drama has over 10.8 million views as well. So anyone who was on this side of TikTok, like me, your For You page was probably filled with just tons of conversation about where Tarte went wrong, if they were in the wrong, just like everything. And this discourse was also happening on other platforms like podcasts, YouTube videos. And it didn't really take long until it made its way into main headlines. So publications like Time Magazine, The Cut, Vogue, were all covering Tarte's mistreatment of creators of color on their influencer trips. And this wasn't just one isolated incident. Bria obviously started a huge storm of conversation that was then bringing up other creators' experiences or experiences from their trips back in 2018. So of course, we're using Tarte as the main example because it's the most widely known recent case of this. But backlash in response to branded influencer trips has, always been a thing. This has happened recently with Revolve and Benefit for being under fire for recent influencer trips. So kind of as we were watching this unfold, we've started questioning, why and how is this happening when it feels like 5 years ago, any brand could take an influencer on a lavish and over the top trip and not face any sort of backlash or critique. So, what is different here? What is the cause? And how do we really avoid that moving forward?
Beautiful. So as we looked at this question, and as Sophie just covered, there's a lot I think that we could talk about here in terms of where things have gone wrong. And we're going to get into some detail about how to get it right and all those sorts of things. But if we're really distilling the kind of shift that we've seen and looking back at the timeline and seeing where these trips emerged out of and how they were originally approached and how they evolved into this more contractual place. And then we had that big gap and now we're here. One of the key reasons we see that this type of miss happens is that a key why behind why a brand can and should have an influencer trip is around relationship building. We know that relationships, again, with influencers and editors can yield really positive business results. And taking someone on a trip is a really great way of getting that time to build a relationship. But building a relationship should be a key objective in your planning and not just an assumed outcome of spending time with someone. And what we mean by that, little analogy here for you is that, you know, as we just touched on, the experience was different for one influencer than other influencers, but the communication that that influencer would have received is that you're invited onto this trip. And the way that we've always thought about running influencer trips or running influencer activations is more like running a dinner party than it is like running a music festival. And so the key distinction there being that if you're hosting a dinner party, you are a host. You are considering every single person's experience. You are trying to cultivate and create an environment where everyone in that experience feels excited, feels connected, even things down to seating placements and what you're serving. It's all an experience that you're curating for everyone to enjoy together, knowing that it's an intimate enough setting that these individuals are going to not only enjoy the experience together, but also compare it together. You're not going to be serving different meals to different people at the table. It's a collective experience to be collectively enjoyed. And again, it is going to be compared because you're all going to be seeing it, versus a scenario more like a larger scale event, like a music festival, where we're all familiar with VIP sections, with kind of sectioning one group out from another. But in that type of a scenario, that is a logistical necessity. And with an influencer trip or an influencer activation, it's really not going to create the type of energy and environment that is conducive of connecting, of relationship building, and of producing good work if you are trying to separate the VIPs from the normies. And so when I sat, and even framing someone as a VIP versus a normie is still viewing someone through a lens of a tier of influencer that you might think of in a spreadsheet based on following or from some other type of bias that might be at play. So, you know, that in this type of environment, in this type of experience is just not how anything should be approached. So with some common planning misconceptions, the first is this idea of having tiered talent, meaning that you can also have tiered experiences. So instead of thinking that way, best to think about how we can make this experience the most special for everybody to collectively enjoy and collectively document. Another one that I think has come out of this kind of how the whole space has evolved, and in a lot of ways the lapse we've had in real life experiences, is that a lot of trips seem to be being planned through the lens of exclusively how things are going to look online versus how they are going to feel in the moment. And again, we're living in a video first, very transparent, very authenticity rooted social environment. And if your influencers aren't having a great time, even if they're not explicitly talking about the fact that they're not having a great time, it will impact the quality of what they're delivering for you, whether that's them participating in the events that you're hosting on site, whether that's them over delivering, whether that's one of the key reasons that you're there to connect with them and to build that relationship to hopefully, you know, lead to stronger results later. You really have to consider how things are going to feel in the moment and hopefully have members of your team who have that skill set available to be able to tap into versus exclusively social and influencer managers. Another is thinking how we can get more bonus content. This is a big why for a lot of brands as to why you would run a trip, that we often see that there is a lot of bonus content, which is great. And that's a huge plus, but it shouldn't just be about more. A big reason, there's other ways to inspire or to kind of motivate bonus content. And if you're going to the trouble and effort of creating a trip, you should be more in the lens of thinking about how we can inspire memorable content. You're creating a moment where people are going to be together for a couple of days. You're getting hopefully consumer attention in a way that you typically don't, because it's tough to get an influencer to talk about your brand consecutively unless you are putting them in that environment. So if you're going to all of that trouble, how are you curating the experience to make sure that your product and brand is deeply connected to what you're doing, to really create content that you wouldn't be able to create if you were just briefing an influencer to create it on their own? This is pretty tactical and logistical, but a big one that we learned, I think the hard way, is viewing through the lens of how do we maximize this itinerary? We've got them here for 72 hours or 48 hours. How do we make sure we can cram as much in as we possibly can to get the best possible outcomes? Spoiler alert, influencers need time to email. They need time to edit, especially if they're creating longer form content. If they're influencers who you're inviting along to trips, they're often big enough that they have a lot of responsibilities that they're juggling. And in order for them to be able to do their jobs effectively, and they are jobs, they're producing incredible results for your brands, they need to be able to manage that email. They need to be able to have time to edit, to manage content review, whatever it might be. And so thinking about your itinerary and being really planful about it is super important, but it is important to consider the fact that everyone is there going to be working. And the next one is, does this make sense on paper? So I think a lot of trips are ideated and planned from the lens of like, our product is this, and we're going to put them in this beautiful location. It's going to create an amazing place. We're going to get bonus content, and it's going to be great. But it's important to ask, will this make sense to the consumer? I referenced the glossy article with the chief brand officer from Revolve, talking about the fact that they're continuing to do trips, but they're doing less of them because to her, the content, one of the reasons is because the content to her feels dated. And to me, a lot of the content that feels dated, it's not that any trip in the world is going to create content that feels dated, but you need to root your experience and your trip, if you're doing one, in something that the consumer is going to understand beyond, oh, I was invited to this thing, yay for me. So, are they there for a reason? Have you built in reasons for them to be there in a way that is going to be compelling to that consumer?
So when you keep those types of planning misconceptions in mind and you take that kind of dinner party planning mentality, and you're creating an influencer trip with, intention, consideration, and a clear purpose, ultimately, there are very real and powerful outcomes that are possible for brands that are honestly exclusive to just influencer trips that can only be done through this type of activation. The first one being a fast-track share of voice. So if you take a group of like-minded influencers on a trip together, all of their feeds are saturated with content revolving around your brand for the next 72 hours. Your brand is saturating the feeds of all of their viewers and all of their followers, and there's really no other situation that this could happen other than a trip. So when we think about a traditional influencer campaign, usually how it'll go is like they'll post, an in-feed, maybe a story, and then their stories are kind of sandwiched between content that has nothing to do with your brand, that is just the day-to-day. But with an influencer trip, the entire span of the next 72 hours is revolving around your brand. And that kind of leads us to bonus content resulting in earned media and an increased ROI. So more often than not, influencers will be posting more deliverables than they were contracted for, just because of the nature of documenting their day-to-day. So Grace had mentioned how kind of content creation fundamentally changed with the introduction of stories and TikTok. So most creators are used to documenting, their entire day, every day. So that will likely result in bonus content and earned media. And then I think one that often gets overlooked a ton is creating your consumer's favorite crossover episode. If you look in the comment section of a successful influencer trip, so many of the comments are like, oh my God, this is my favorite crossover episode of all time. And that's really because consumers love seeing two of their favorite influencers connect and meet in real life. It kind of feels like they're part of this friendship blooming, and your brand is the cause for it. And that feels really exciting to consumers. The next one is top of mind awareness boost. So an influencer trip can be like a huge cut through moment for your brand. So most consumers actually need to see a brand message 7 times before converting into a sale. So I think this is especially, relevant and important for brands who are trying to regain relevancy. We were talking about influencer trips recently while we were at the Fohr bar, and one of our colleagues mentioned, like, did you see that Guess took Alex Earl to Coachella? I haven't thought about Guess in years. Like, that was so wild and random. And it's like, but that's literally it. Like, you hadn't thought of Guess in years, and now you are, because Alex Earl was posting about them for an entire weekend. And then robust storytelling and high quality asset creation. So hosting your own trip allows brands to really be in control of the entire environment, the narrative, and really has a unique opportunity to create high quality assets around that. So in a traditional campaign, you're usually putting the hands of the creative solely in the influencer. You can give them a brief, but you have no control in what that end product is going to look like. But on a trip, you can also have, photographers, videographers capturing this kind of trip in addition to all of the organic content that you are creating to really tell a story that can make huge waves. And the last one, but obviously is one of the most important ones that Grace was touching on, is there's simply no digital replacement for spending time together. And this is a huge way to build relationships. You will simply not get the same depth of a relationship through, email or DMs. So we're going to get into a few real examples of brands that have done this successfully and kind of how and why they were successful. So the first one is Cynthia Rowley's annual surf camp. So every summer, Cynthia Rowley hosts a 2-day getaway to Montauk, kind of in tandem with the launch of their new swim and wetsuit collection. So basically their guests arrive in Montauk, they're able to go on in store and try on and pick out, their wetsuit and swimsuit of choice. And then from there, they actually get to go to the beach and get a surf lesson. And then after the surf lesson is done, they get to sit down at an intimate dinner with Cynthia Rowley herself, and have a really unique opportunity to speak in real life to the brand founder, where kind of anyone is able to do that. And the reason this works so well is, first, category and top of mind awareness boost. So consumers are now aware that Cynthia Rowley even carries, chic wetsuits and bathing suits. Like, I know for me, I knew that Cynthia Rowley existed, and I consider them to be like a dress company. Like, I don't actually follow the brand. And it wasn't until an influencer that I follow, I saw go on this trip, and I was like, oh, like Cynthia Rowley carries really cute wetsuits and swimwear. I had no idea. And of course, relationship building. So influencers having that unique opportunity to sit down at a dinner table with Cynthia Rowley herself, they can connect with other influencers, or they can connect with the brand team. And then the last one being brand storytelling. So this trip is really like an embodiment of the brand's philosophy that fashion should be an adventure. And as we were kind of digging into this trip and kind of how it was so successful, I found a piece that was written by an editor who got sent on one of these trips, and saying that she ultimately felt like her outlook on life had changed leaving, based on a conversation that she had had with Cynthia Rowley, kind of talking about how she had discovered surfing in her 30s, which is usually, surfing is something you usually grow up around. I don't really hear much about people picking it up late in their life, and how she was just so inspired by Cynthia's story of like, you can pick up any type of passion or hobby late in your life and it be fulfilling, and it'd be like a new start to something. And she was like, I left feeling so fulfilled and having that one-on-one connection with Cynthia, and like really understanding the whole philosophy behind her brand. The next one is the Nike Women Marathon Project. So Nike essentially challenged 40 women who had never run a marathon before to take part in the Chicago Marathon. And basically, in order to be considered for this project, they had to write their own Just Do It story, which was essentially a time that they had overcome adversity. And so once they were accepted, the Nike team then, helped train this group of women over the course of 15 weeks, then leading up to Nike flying them out to the Chicago Marathon to, become marathoners for their first time. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is just the robust storytelling and kind of brand messaging that was just sewn perfectly into this entire project and trip. Like, the entire project was a personification of Nike's slogan, Just Do It. Like, Nike's team and the creators selected were basically creating and posting content surrounding how a group of first-time marathoners, make their dreams come true through just like sheer will and commitment and determination, which is essentially the entire sentiment behind Just Do It. And then, of course, over, the next 15 weeks, there was an immense amount of community building going on. These women were training day in and day out all together, getting ready for this marathon, all under the guise of Nike. And, training for and finishing a marathon is such a huge bonding experience, especially at one of the biggest marathons and most well-known in the world. And seeing these people and following these creators that got selected afterwards, so many of them are still talking about Nike in an organic sense and talking about this trip and finishing a marathon months and months afterwards. So there was just an intense amount of community building happening that just created these long-lasting relationships where they're continually talking about your brand even months after the trip is over. And then the last one is near and dear to our heart. It's a Sephora Squad's welcome event, which the Fohr team obviously has a huge part in. So shout out to those team members. But if you don't know, Sephora Squad is a really robust ambassador program that's usually like 50 to 70 members who get a year-long contract with Sephora. So to kind of kick off that program, Sephora flies out and hosts all of the Sephora Squad members who are able to make it for a 3-day kickoff in Los Angeles. So the squad is really able to meet other members. They're able to meet the brand team, the influencer team. They learn from beauty founders like Mario from Makeup by Mario. They kind of have an orientation into the program. They have a full day that's dedicated to just exploring Los Angeles and kind of just having their own downtime. But it's a really thoughtful and purposeful trip, so much so that I often forget that it's technically an influencer trip because it's so grounded in a purpose and a why that is usually absent from what we think of when we hear influencer trips. And I think why this works so well is, number one, community and relationship building. A lot of other brands have ambassadors who have no idea who the other ambassadors are. They really just work in a silo where it's just them emailing a brand contact and kind of fulfilling their contracted posts. But Sephora Squad kind of hosting a trip like this builds a sense of, community and camaraderie and a sense of belonging, which is also just so central to Sephora's brand. And it also creates that huge consumer crossover episode that we were talking about. And I think that's especially true for beauty brands because the online beauty community is huge. So for a beauty lover, it's really exciting to see, Glowpedia and Glamzilla in the same room together. And that's all thanks to Sephora. And then I think this is really a prime example of the fast-tracked share of voice. That's so huge for this trip because for the next 3 days, Sephora saturates the feeds of over 26.9 million beauty lovers. That is wild to think about. And so I think a common thread amongst, all successful influencer trips comes down to both how your guests will feel, but ultimately how your consumer will feel when they're watching it. And so a really easy way to kind of think about this is, will my consumer watch this and think like, oh my God, good for you. That's incredible. Like, I feel so proud to have watched you, be able to achieve this, which is so much of the sentiment that we see on trips like Sephora Squad's welcome event. Or will they think like, great, good for you, I roll, like another lavish influencer trip for no reason? So that's a pretty good guiding light when you're trying to think of if your influencer trip will be well received.
Oh, well, okay, there we go. Amazing. So to close this out, and then I can see some great questions in the Q&A that it looks like we are going to have some time for, which is awesome. So feel free if you've got any others to drop those in. That would be awesome. But some key takeaways. First is to really know your why. Again, all of those examples that Sophie just shared, all of them have a very rich, deep why. I'm sure a lot of you out there are like, okay, great. We're not going to be able to get all of those people to run a marathon. We're not Nike. That's a really big why. But again, launching or personifying a brand moment, creating connectivity to launch one of the biggest ambassador programs, even shooting a campaign together. Like if there's a why behind why you're there that the influencer can speak to their audience about in a way that's really compelling, beyond just I was invited, it's a huge win. The next is to invite existing partners and to ensure a baseline contract exists. So we've talked a lot about relationship building. I'd say that it's about relationship building and deepening, not necessarily like starting a new relationship. Again, if you're going to have a group of people here together, you first of all want to have a sense of who they are and how they operate and the type of partner that they are. A trip or an activation should be something that's kind of meaningful and that represents something. And in order to get to that place of meaning, there should be a relationship that's already established between you and that person, and this should be about deepening it and strengthening it. And as far as ensuring a baseline contract exists, so that could be that you're kicking off a huge year of work together and this is a welcome event. It could be that you are contracting baseline deliverables for them to deliver on while they're there, and you're hopeful of other bonus content. But I'd say for the most part, the era of just inviting people along like they're an editor and expecting there to be coverage and content is not really where we're at. Simple way of remembering that or rationalizing that in your mind as well is that editors have a salary and influencers don't. And they are delivering value for you. You have to understand that. So there does need to be some kind of baseline contract involved. It's not to say they can't be tiered, and it's not to say that certain influencers, this is going to be a rarer opportunity than others, but it's something that's really important. The next is to focus again on relationship building as an objective. Don't assume it will happen as an outcome. So again, this is just central to how you're approaching your planning, how you're approaching your itinerary, how you're approaching who you're inviting and why. So if you touched on the crossover episode aspect, having people there as well that, you know, maybe there's some familiarity between individuals, not all of them, but some of them, maybe there's that adds some additional comfort. Again, being really considerate of everyone's experience and making sure that you're putting time and thought and energy into being intentional about how they're going to feel and not just thinking about how it's going to look on social is huge, because they're all connected. If they feel great, it's going to look better on social, and you can't just think about that as the end product. Which brings us again back to not tiering experiences. So I just referenced that there are different tiers of experience. There's, you know, inviting people to a local hotel is very different than inviting people to a castle in the south of France. But if you're inviting a group of people to either of those places, you shouldn't be creating hierarchy of who gets what within those attendees. It's too intimate of a setting. It feels embarrassing, frankly, if you're the person who's getting the sub-tier experience to someone else who's there, and you're entering an environment where you're feeling like you're all a part of this trip and a part of this thing, and then you realize, like, wait a minute, I'm not. Again, back to the dinner party analogy, it's like showing up and realizing that half of the party gets dessert and you don't. And you're like, okay, well, what? Why did you invite me here? It's just too intimate of a setting for power rankings, and it's unfair. And the final one is, again, putting your consumers first. Baseless lavish can give the ick. So if there's not a real why and there's not meaning and there's not true intention behind what you're doing, and there's not a reason for the consumer to understand as to why you're there beyond to just be impressed, it can create that like eye roll moment, not the, oh wow, good for you. Like, we want the good for you, not the bad good for you. And so with that, I think we're ready to open it up to some questions. And while I figure out my screen sharing situation, I already have the first one lined up, and Sophie, I'll let you start on it. But it was around, and I have a few thoughts on this, but it is around what our position is on +1s on a trip. So I'll be one moment if you have any thoughts to share briefly, and then I'll jump back into.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of +1s, I think that if you're going to offer it to one person, you should offer it to all people. And if you're not going to offer it, then don't offer it to anyone. I think there are, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? There are like exceptions to that rule. There are some people who like need, you know, they need someone with them in terms of like accessibility purposes. And I think that's like totally different. But if you're giving one person the option, everyone else should have the option, and vice versa. And I also think it just depends on the type of event that you're happening, like the type of event that you're hosting. I think if it's something that's more like intensive, like an orientation where you're going to be like in and out of meetings and stuff like that, sometimes you don't need a +1 for that. Like it's almost like a work trip in a sense. Or there are other trips that are like the tarts where it's like, I personally would feel so uncomfortable where it's like, all I'm doing is just like schmoozing with other people and I don't have someone I know. In that sense, I think you should probably consider offering +1s in that sense. Grace, I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
Totally. I agree with everything that you just said. But I think the discomfort thing is an important thing to hit on and just consider. Again, there are scenarios where if it is more like an orientation, it's more intensive, maybe this isn't the case. Or if you're running a trip where, you know, again, maybe this is an existing ambassador group, maybe you've already created a bit of community or connectivity between them, and you're confident that there is going to be a little bit more comfort level. And again, you've built in downtime for them to also be able to work and email and edit. In that scenario, maybe you don't need to go there. However, if you are trying to lean more into the direction of just really creating a really beautiful, meaningful experience, and you can swing the +1s as part of it, it does tend to really shift and change people's experience. But I would say as well that it's better for when it's a really small group of influencers, because all of a sudden if there's +1s and it's a group of 20 people, now it's just too big of a group. But if it's something where it's really, really intimate and the influencers are also potentially getting this type of demand for trips quite frequently, in order for them to not just see it as work and to really be able to enjoy it, it can be amazing to be able to have someone there, to be able to create that additional comfort for them, to be able to help them shoot, and yeah, to just really have that type of dynamic where you're almost trying to create the feeling that it's not a work trip. So I think there's kind of two distinct categories there, but the key one is if you're giving anyone a +1, unless there's an accessibility exception or something like that, as Sophie mentioned, it has to be everyone, or it's going to be a why this, why that. So I think the next question we have, there was one around if brands are, if it's about relationship building and not content, for example, are influencers being paid to attend? So I can give a quick clarification on this one. It is, so I would say that for the most part, there are still content deliverables, there are still social deliverables. It's not just, hey, we're paying you to come on this thing. In fact, I'd say it's probably rarer to pay someone to just attend something versus paying them for concrete deliverables. The main thing there is just, again, remembering that, think about how many rooms you've been in with people that you have built no relationship with and that you have not connected with at all. And there are some environments and some settings and dynamics and itineraries or any of those things that are really conducive to connecting with other people and to being able to have time to converse with them. And there are others where it's too hectic, it's too much, it's too cold, it's too many, it's just very different. So I think the key thing there is, again, to just remember that a key reason why it is so amazing sometimes to do influencer trips or activations is because there's no substitute for in real life time. In real life time also doesn't just mean that you are going to build a relationship with someone. I've met many people in real life that I never care to speak to ever again. But Soph, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that was perfect.
Awesome. Are there any of these questions that are jumping out to you? There's quite a few in here now.
Yeah, there was one recently asked about the room allocations. So it says during the Tart, Turks and Caicos trip, there was a significant controversy regarding the allocation of rooms. Considering the limited number of suites available, how did you approach the task of assigning rooms without breaking them up by tiers? So added context for anyone who doesn't know, part of that conversation that was kind of getting brought up after Bria made the video was influencers talking about being brought on Tart trips that are usually hosted in villas and their rooms just being split up unfairly. Like someone like an Alex Earl has like this massive luxe room and then somebody else has a dinkier room or a toilet broken. The way that we mitigate that, like for example, the Sephora squad trip, we host those in a hotel and give everyone the same standard room. I think villas are harder. And I think that a learning for Tart is like, probably don't host these in villas anymore, because there is no way to basically control everyone having the same room. And the only way to do that is just to like basically take out that variable and host it in a hotel. I think that that's your best bet to make sure that no one feels like they're being treated unfairly.
I think I agree with that. I think to add to that too, sometimes, you know, if some rooms are better than even on a work trip, I'm like, what's your room like? What's your room like? Like they're not all exactly the same. And sometimes maybe you're filling out a whole hotel, and maybe there are some people getting slightly better rooms than others. I'd say that again comes back to ideally these trips are with partners that you already have an existing relationship with, that you've already built some trust with, or that you already have, you know, a bit of a dynamic there with. So there's the circumstances are there to assume that this is a logistical decision and not one where it's like, oh, this group's over here and this group's over here. There are some things that can be a little unavoidable or a little tough to manage, or a little tough to even, you know, plan when you're planning remotely. But I think it's really important, again, to just really be cognizant of it, and to be cognizant of the fact that it is going to be something that's going to be like compared and contrasted. So you want to be really mindful about it. Okay, again, a lot here, but we have, there's one that's contract wise. What's the industry standard to include in those? Are there larger influencers getting paid to go on the trip and post brand messaging? Short answer is absolutely. There are a lot of big influencers who are getting paid to go on the trip and post branded messaging. And again, I think that if you're inviting people to a multi-day activation in this kind of day and age, it is probably important to have some kind of baseline contract in place. A big benefit of these types of experiences and investing time and money and energy into making them special is, again, that ideally people are really enjoying them, and you'll see some bonus organic content, and you'll be able to get that fast-tracked share of voice, as Sophie was talking about. So yes, that big influencers are often paid to go on these trips and post branded messaging. So there's not really industry standard in terms of the types of deliverables that are being requested, but for a couple of days, you know, and again, usually there's a couple of experiences involved in these things. Brands are typically wanting to make sure that whatever experiences or key moments they are putting on are going to be covered in some capacity. So I'd say the most standard thing is having enough deliverables in place to be able to cover those, and then relying on the bonus content for the in-between and for like really getting that saturation. So if you want to grab any of these questions, one that's jumping out to you.
Yeah, one of them was, in terms of casting, any key recommendations for looking at a cast of influencers in terms of diversity, following, etc. I think that should be top of mind for any activation that you do with influencers, but I think specific for trips and events, when thinking about when you do have a cast of diverse influencers, is making sure that you are considering every single person's experience. So for example, if you have someone on the trip who's differently abled, making sure that all of your event spaces are ADA compliant. Like, you don't want to invite someone who's differently abled and then they're not able to get into the building that you're accessing or the restaurant that you're accessing, keeping that in mind. Or if you have influencers who are Muslim and you're taking them on a trip in the middle of Ramadan, making sure that your events coordinate with the times that they're able to, you know, stop fasting and eat. And that's kind of that mentality that Grace was talking about, where you have to consider every single person's experience and making sure it's special, because you don't want to run into an issue where you are, you know, throwing this trip and then hiring people for diversity's sake and then not making it fun for them or accessible for them. That would just be a horrible situation to be in. So I think when planning, just considering every single person's situation and making sure it's going to be the best experience for them possible.
Totally. And then as far as following goes too, I'd just add to that. I think in an ideal world, because a lot of the instances we're talking about here are pretty major trips. Like we're talking about Tart, where it's this huge trip and there's decent, like pretty big influencers, but also some micro influencers. There's also some, again, more local activations, or more, we have some small businesses on here, some large, huge brands. When you're thinking about casting, I'd say that in an ideal world, the experience that you're putting on does feel like something special to the influencer that you are working with. So if you're a huge brand with endless budget and you are wanting to get some of those really, really heavy hitters onto this trip to, again, hopefully get some bonus content, hopefully build a stronger relationship, that's great. I think very important and awesome for you that you have that budget and that you can do that. And we would love to speak. But it's important to remember that and just be realistic. This is something that I've thought about a lot and had to check myself on. What's normal for someone who's done this type of thing 20 times is it's harder to be special just through splash and just through like, oh my God, the hotel's so amazing, or oh my God, they're getting all of these experiences. Like they should be more grateful. Like you can't project your own life experience or lack thereof as it relates to luxury hotels and luxury experiences and being jetted around the world onto someone else who has had that. That's a really tough thing to like grapple with, but the best way to overcome it is to remember that it's not just about impressing them through, again, rolling the red carpet out. They're still human beings who want to feel connected to other people and who want to feel like the work that they're doing is appreciated and that they are being considered, and that you have thought about their experience and care about it. So if you're going really big, I would say it's just important to have a little bit of that reality check of like, what's amazing and rare and maybe a first time for me maybe isn't for them, and therefore we have to think about that as we're thinking about their contract and deliverables. And on the flip side, you can use that to your advantage to say like, okay, well, what type of experience can I offer? Maybe in terms of the strategy and how I'm building it out, I can try to tap into influencers who have a really powerful audience and connection to their audience, produce really beautiful and amazing content, but aren't on a jet every 2 weeks, or aren't, on a trip all the time, or aren't like their calendar isn't just clogged with what now feels like an obligation, because you do want to be able to, if you're curating a special experience, you want it to feel special. So that can be a consideration. And again, as it relates to following, just remember that like, if you have, I think something that's so powerful about bringing a group together is that the group together, similar to the crossover episode piece, it collectively says something about who you are as a brand when they're together. It's no longer just about this person. It's like the kind of fusion and mixture of them that creates this really dynamic subconscious message to consumers about who your brand is. And so in that time and in that moment, it's not a place for thinking of if one person has a smaller following and one person has a larger one, like who's bringing more to the table. It's that everyone has been brought in to enjoy this together. Okay. Well, I think we're running up on time. Any final ones that you want to hit on, Sophie? Or we'd love to hear from anyone who has additional questions. We talked about the email at the top of the presentation, but the easiest one is hello@fohr.co, .co, not .com. We have a wonderful team who all would be super excited to talk to you about this in more detail. We have a bar in our office. Trips right now, it's like the main conversation. So if you have any and all questions, we'd love to hear from you at hello@fohr.co. Thank you all again for Soph, anything else there before I just ask you and then cut you off? Okay, cool. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, we know how busy everyone is and it's a lot of time to take out of the day. So we're very grateful and flattered that you all take the time out of it to join us. Hope it was worth your time and we would love to hear from you. So we'll be in touch on email with the key takeaways and we're available. Ta-ta. Bye-bye.
Bye.